Interrupt the energy in the room. This is what this is really all about, that everybody keeps talking to each other and sharing ideas, and I'm still waiting for a volunteer for the second mucmd meeting, but that's okay. You have a couple of days to come forward. That was a small joke. Our next two speakers will be speaking together, as you can see in the program, collecting and using exploration data in medical settings. And our first speaker is Alina Begelzimmer, who works at IBM and Watson Research Labs. Is that it? Only to be a little confused with the IBM Watson other by another name. It is the same group by the same name. And John Langford, who is a senior researcher at Yahoo. They have a relationship outside of work as well, rumor has it, and they have agreed to come and give this talk together. So it is a great pleasure to have them here. They have a huge amount of published work between them, and we hope to share and learn from it. So, Alina.
Thanks. So we are in machine learning, and we encounter exploration problems all the time. So the goal of the talk today is to share some of the techniques that we have, and they don't seem to be very common in the medical community, so we hope to share them. And please feel free to interrupt at any time. So the first part of the talk, which is what I'm going to give, is about collecting exploration data. And John will talk about using exploration data that have already been collected. So I will define the problem. I will mention the approaches that have been adopted, so randomized clinical trials and Bayesian methods. And then I will talk about optimal ways to collect exploration data and how to deal with delayed responses. So here is a problem. Patients arrive sequentially, and they must be treated by one of K treatments for a given disease. So a doctor observes a patient, chooses a treatment, and observes how the patient responds. So why is it an exploration problem? Well, because the doctor doesn't see what would have happened had a different treatment been chosen, right? So it's only sort of partial information that the doctor gets, right? Okay. So the goal is to find a personalized treatment policy for a given disease, because a patient has context, right? So there's a whole bunch of information that can be used about the patient to make better decisions, and we would like our policies to be context dependent. The problem of clinical trials is essentially the same problem, except here exploration is limited to patients in the trial. But the goal is to treat patients both in and out of the trial as efficiently as possible. So some drugs work better in some patients than in others. You really don't want population-based treatments. You want to learn context-dependent policies, and that's what we will talk about. So the question is, can we redesign clinical trials so that they're adaptive, which means that we don't waste patient resources. We use them as wisely as we can while still maintaining the integrity of the study, and can we make them personalized instead of population-based. So let's formalize the setting. For T, from 1 to some horizon, capital T. So T ranges over the patients. You see some context. You can encode anything you would like in X sub T. So molecular information, various admission data, any information you have about the patient. And then you have a set of actions that you can take, which are different treatments that you're exploring. And then you receive the reward. So for now, we will assume that reward is given to you right away, but then I'll talk about how to deal with delayed responses, which is a common problem. And we want to learn a good policy for taking actions given context, given a new patient. So how do we evaluate success? I will talk about a notion called regret, which I'll define formally here. So let's say you have a set of policies. Policies are basically decision-making processes that map patients to actions. So a doctor is a policy, but you can have different policies. I will give examples in a minute. And you want to minimize your regret to the best policy. So you don't know, you have a bunch of policies, you don't know which one is good. And you are exploring the space incrementally, and you would like to do not much worse than the best policy in your set. And regret is literally your regret, right? So that's the number of unnecessary lives lost. You can think of it this way. And you want to minimize that. And we will talk about optimal algorithms for minimizing it. So if you have K treatments and you want to choose the best one overall without taking context into account, so you can think of them as being constant policies. So there are policies that ignore the patient's context and just choose this treatment for everyone, which is common in clinical trials. You can have a machine learning system, which is just a bunch of different regressors on your features, which encode patient's information. Or maybe you can even enumerate a set of policies based on your hypotheses about the disease. So doctor may come up with a set of policies which map patients to actions, but it's unclear which one is best, and you want to do nearly as well as the best one in hindsight for any set of patients. So you want adaptive methods for choosing actions that guarantee that for any set of patients, you're not much worse than the best in hindsight, the best policy. So let's look at what has been adopted. The dominant approach is randomized clinical trials, which basically means that you explore uniformly at random for patients in the trial, for tau patients, and then you apply the best policy for everyone outside the trial. So it's a simplification, but that's essentially what it is. You explore uniformly at random, then you choose the best one empirically on that set, and you apply it outside the trial. So most trials are adaptive in very limited ways, so there are stopping criteria and so on. But often, unless something drastic happens, tau is fixed in advance, and assignment probabilities do not depend on the context or on the information that you have already collected in the process. So what is the regret for these trials? It turns out that the regret scales as T, capital T, which is the sort of the total number of patients with the disease, to the 2/3 times K to the 1/3, where K is fairly small. It's the number of treatments that you're choosing from. So really you should think about the dependence on T. And the optimal setting of tau is also of the same order, which is sort of the optimal size of your trial if you want to minimize this notion of regret. And you can actually do the same analysis for arbitrary policy sets. So not just for constant treatments, but also for contextual treatments as well. with the same dependence on T. I will not, it's a simple theorem, but I will not go through it. So it extends to arbitrary policy sets, but the dependence, as we will see, is suboptimal. So the regret scales as T to the 2/3. Are there any questions about the notion of regret? Okay. So Bayesian approaches have been adopted, and I'll give an example of sort of state-of-the-art clinical trials that use Bayesian methods. So this is what Bayesian methods are about. You have some prior belief about the distributions that generate responses to treatments. So you have some prior that you choose, and then you observe responses, and you update your prior into a posterior distribution using the Bayes theorem. So that's what Bayesian trials are about. And then you can ask questions like, what's the best treatment given the current posterior distribution so as to maximize the expected reward over some population? Or you can ask other questions like that, and then you can just do backward induction or dynamic programming to find the right answer. So given the prior, given your choice of prior, this is not an exploration problem, it's just an optimization problem. It's a computationally difficult one, but there is no exploration here. So there are different heuristics for doing it efficiently for convenient choices of prior distributions. So Thompson sampling, for example, says, well, you have your posterior, now just sample any parameters from that posterior and act according to the argmax. So it can be implemented efficiently for convenient choices of priors. There are some disadvantages of these methods. First, there are no finite horizon guarantees in general. So you can have some sort of guarantees when you assume a convenient form of your prior distribution, but there are no sort of guarantees on regret. It's hard to incorporate context, and there's a need to specify a prior, which is so you can manipulate that and encode various biases, which you may not want to do. But this is a way to do adaptive trials, and this is what has been adopted in the medical community. Computational problems. So there is a trade-off between losing any type of guarantees. And so we'll give an example of a limited way to incorporate context. So I-SPY2 trial is a trial for breast cancer. And so there's some eligibility criteria, and patients who pass that criteria are split into 14 different groups. So this is, you discretize your context information. So you have 14 values of your context information, and you run an independent Bayesian trial in each. So this is sort of a limited way to use context information. You just split on context and run an independent, a separate Bayesian trial in each. This is great because, I mean, it's better than not doing that, because drugs can perform differently in different groups, and you have a mechanism for pushing drugs quickly for certain groups, or stopping drugs for certain groups. So it's definitely context dependent, but it's not an optimal way to use context. It's a very limited way. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So, I mean, Gittins indices, this is just an example of Bayesian methods where you assume independence of the distributions that generate rewards for each treatment, which means that you cannot incorporate context because incorporating context makes them dependent. So they're very fragile because once independence breaks, you no longer have the guarantees. So it gives you a computationally sort of efficient way, or more exponentially more efficient than just doing full-blown Bayesian methods for given this assumption on independence of the different distributions.
Can I ask one other kind of
Yeah.
related question? So the initial 14 groups is based on some mathematical probability or just
On the signature, on the molecular signature of the patient. So they use HER score and HER, plus or minus. So there are different sort of signatures you can have for a patient with breast cancer, and they're just split on. They're choosing 14 meaningful signatures.
And I guess the question is that the assumption is that we've got the right 14 signatures. What if another set of signatures came up? Can you retrospectively go back and reanalyze the data?
Well, you will not have the data because the patients were not eligible unless they fall into these 14 signatures. So they just chose the signatures where they have a critical number of patients with that signature. And yeah. So I don't know much about, but they were pre-selected signatures that were meaningful to the doctors. Okay, so let's look at a simple algorithm that's adaptive but does not use context, and then see how to extend it to the one that does. So let's say that you have just K treatments and you want to choose the best one overall. There is no context. So what you can do is you can take the first group of K patients and you can assign one. You can sort of explore uniformly at random by assigning one patient to each treatment. And then you will have an empirical reward estimate for each treatment. And then you will continue doing that until you can remove one of the treatments, because the difference between the empirical reward of the best treatment, of the empirically best treatment, and this treatment is larger than this value that's determined at the top, the mu value, which guarantees that with high probability you can eliminate it. So there is an assumption that patients come independently from some distributions, and you can use deviation bounds, just standard deviation bounds, to eliminate treatments once the empirical gap between their rewards becomes significantly large. So you know that with high probability, the true difference in the rewards must be large as well. So you can safely eliminate treatments. And you can continue doing that. So you randomize uniformly at random among the remaining treatments until you can eliminate based on the empirical estimates of the reward. Is that clear? So you continue randomizing uniformly at random among the surviving treatments, and you eliminate as soon as you have enough evidence based on standard deviation bounds that you can safely eliminate a treatment, because the empirical gap is large enough, even if you take into account the sort of the current deviation margins. And that's a kind of guarantee that you can get. So deltas are gaps between the true reward, the true expectations. So this is not a worst case bound. This is a bound that actually depends on your distribution on the actual gaps. So if you have just 2 treatments and you want to choose the best one, then the number of samples, the number of patients that you need to see before you can do that scales roughly as 1 over delta squared, where delta is the difference in the reward expectations. But since we care about the regret scales as root t instead of t to the 2/3. So this is major. This is a factor of 10 on a population of 1 million. A factor of 10 in terms of saved lives. So this is a big difference. But context is not taken into account here, so let's see how we can use a similar bound algebra in order to eliminate policies instead of constant treatments. So there are actually many algorithms that achieve this optimal regret. One such algorithm is known as EXP4, and that's the optimal regret bound that scales as root t, where t is your population, case the number of treatments, which is often small, and log of the size of the number of policies under the square root. So this dependence is, again, in terms of the number of policies, it's exponentially faster than evaluating each policy independently. So it's a pretty good bound. So I will describe an algorithm that achieves the same bound, but does it faster. And that's similar to action elimination, except that it's a bit more involved because there are biases due to this partial information aspect of the problem that weren't there in the action elimination because you were randomizing uniform not random among the remaining policies. This policy elimination will maintain a set of active policies that you haven't eliminated yet, throw in bounds that were proved to be suboptimal based on deviation bounds. And central to this process is the notion of an importance-weighted estimator of the reward. You cannot just take the average reward because the probabilities with which things will get sampled will not be uniform. So you need this notion, and John will talk about this in more detail, but you need this notion, you need to get an unbiased estimator of the reward of each policy. You need to importance weight, which means that you need to divide the observed reward by the probability of choosing that action. Or choosing the action that the policy chooses. So at every step, you take an action, and there is some set of policies that agree with that action, and some set that doesn't. So for the policies that do not agree with the action, you contribute 0 in that step to the estimate of their reward. And for the policies that do, you divide the observed reward by the probability of sampling that policy. Or you need to do that in order to get an unbiased estimate of the reward. And policy elimination uses those unbiased estimates of the reward, and it chooses this distribution P in such a way as to control the variance of these estimates as well, so that you can eliminate quickly. So here's an algorithm. It may look a bit scary, but it's not much, conceptually it's not much different from this action elimination algorithm that we saw earlier. So for each patient, we will define, we will keep a distribution capital P sub T over the remaining policies. So there are some policies that are still active, that are still not eliminated. And we will choose carefully a distribution capital P sub T over these policies. But before we do that, let's define a projected distribution onto the actions, onto the treatments. And this is just, so it's given in that little p sub t line, which is essentially what's the probability that if you choose a random policy from that distribution, this action is going to be the action chosen by that random policy. So you project the distribution over policies onto the distribution over actions, except that you mix a little with the uniform distribution. So you make sure that every action that's still active, every treatment gets some small probability of being chosen. That's the mix and that you see in that definition. And so we want to choose the distribution over policies to have this guarantee about the expectation. We want to basically, because 1 over P that you see there sort of measures the variance, and we want to upper bound the variance of the estimators. So then we observe context, we choose an action, a treatment from this projected distribution, we observe the reward, and then we eliminate policies that we can eliminate using bound algebra. So there is some empirically best policy, and then we eliminate all the policies whose estimated reward is much worse, where much is determined by the deviation bounds. So conceptually, the algorithm is pretty simple. You want to compete with a set of policies. At every step, you have a set of policies that you haven't eliminated yet. You're defining a distribution over that set so that every action still has some probability of being chosen. Then you choose an action, you observe the reward, you update your unbiased estimates of the reward of every policy, and then you look at the empirically best policies so far, and you throw away all the policies whose empirical estimate is much worse. And you continue doing that until you're left with one policy. And so the regret of the scheme scales as square root of t, where t is the population size, which is pretty good. So if responses are delayed, it's an important point. You can modify this algorithm so that regret is additive in the delay instead of multiplicative, as you would expect. So if you take an action and then 10 patients later you see the reward, so this tau will be 10, and it's additive instead of multiplicative. So this is just a brief summary. I apologize if this wasn't clear, but I hope that at least a conceptual flavor of the algorithms is clear. So for randomized trials, regret scales as t to the 2/3, where regret is basically unnecessary lives lost. With Bayesian methods, there aren't guarantees of this type. There are optimal algorithms that achieve regret of the order of t⁻². And we hope that they will get used.